Wife-swapping is becoming a popular evening pastime, we're told, and quite a pleasant one, some would say, until a fifth partner appears to break the square dance. And that's what happened in Dorchester Close, Fulchester, an estate of fashionable executive houses. Margaret Lawler had an affair with Trevor Sanderson, who'd been having an affair with Christine Blanford. And the prosecution says that Mrs. Blanford maliciously wounded Mrs. Lawler with a kebab spit at a barbecue in the Blanfords' garden. Mrs. Blanford says she slipped on the wet grass. She's coming to the end of her re-examination in Fulchester Crown Court.
Now, you said earlier that your indiscreet liaison with Mr. Sanderson had been foolish and that you refused to continue sexual relations with him. Now, did you decide to do anything else in order to try and rectify the situation?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
Well, I've always been one for talking things over. So I arranged a dinner party for the Saturday night after the barbecue. I thought we could discuss things and come to a civilized conclusion about what was the best thing to do. But, of course, that awful accident took things out of my control.
Now, whom did you invite to this party?
Anita and Trevor. I knew nothing about Margaret Lawler.
Thank you, Mrs. Blanford. I call Douglas Blanford, my lord.
Douglas Blanford, please. Come this way, sir.
What is your religion?
I don't believe in all that rubbish.
Do you wish to affirm?
Sure, I can tell the truth without all that mumbo-jumbo.
Please read the words on this card.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Are you Douglas Blanford?
I am.
And you live at 42 Dorchester Close, Fulchester?
I do.
Mr. Blanford, what sort of temperament does your wife have?
Oh, she's very understanding, very tolerant.
Have you ever known her to be violent?
No. There's no reason for violence. You can get what you want in this life without violence.
Have you never had marital squabbles?
Well, you couldn't quarrel with Christine if you tried. Oh, she waffles on a bit about the kids and cooking and things like that, but no, we never quarrel.
How long have you been married?
12 years.
And would you say it's a happy marriage?
Well, happy and marriage is what I call a contradiction in terms. We're very good friends.
Well, have you ever considered leaving your wife?
No, not at all. She's a very good mother to me and the kids.
Do you have a lot of parties?
Yes, we do. Entertaining is part and parcel of my job. We love it.
And are your parties usually successful?
Yes, always. Christine is a very good hostess. You know, they call our house the Club Mediterranee. It's always full of people.
Now, is your wife of a jealous disposition?
No. Wouldn't have married her if she had been.
Mr. Blanford, are you having an affair with Anita Sanderson?
No, not an affair. We sleep together.
I see. And how do you manage to reconcile this with a successful marriage?
Well, it's part of it. Sort of part of the modern marriage. Keeps the marriage alive.
Modern marriage. Mr. Blanford, how does modern marriage differ from marriage as prescribed in the prayer book? Does modern marriage encompass adultery?
Well, we don't think of it as adultery. If it's an arrangement, then there's no harm done.
That is an opinion which, in my experience in the courts, does not work out. Continue, please, Miss Tate.
My lord, did you know of your wife's sexual relationship with Mr. Sanderson?
Yes, of course I did.
And did the nature of that relationship change?
Yes, it sort of broke up.
In what way?
Well, they lost interest in the sex.
You mean they ceased being lovers?
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, Christine decided that she wanted to devote her whole life to the home and the family.
And did she ask you to do likewise?
No, she wouldn't dream of it. And I didn't.
Now, as far as you know, was your wife aware of Mr. Sanderson's close friendship with Mrs. Lawler?
No.
Mr. Blanford, was your wife's behaviour in any way abnormal on the night of the party?
No, she was very bright, very animated, but then she always is. She's a very good conversationalist.
Did she have a disagreement with anyone?
She had a difference of opinion with Mrs. Lawler.
Did she seek out Mrs. Lawler in order to argue with her?
No, she was far too busy keeping the party humming.
Mr. Blanford, did you witness the incident with the kebab stick?
I did, yes.
Will you describe to us what happened, please?
Well, the barbecue was standing a bit rickety on the lawn. I suppose I should have seen to it, or got somebody in to see to it, but quite frankly, I can't really be bothered with that sort of thing. The grass was wet, and she just slipped.
Was she screaming abuse at Mrs. Lawler?
Christine never screams, let alone abuse.
Well, was she speaking as she fell?
She shouted a warning as she fell, yes.
Now, Mr. Blanford, what are your relations with your next-door neighbour, Mr. Curtis?
Very cool.
Why is that?
Well, I had to speak to him after he'd pestered my wife.
He'd pestered your wife?
Yeah. He and Christine had a conversation, as a result of which I went to see him, and he admitted having made an improper suggestion to her. I said that she was very upset by what I could only describe as his familiarity.
And how did Mr. Curtis react to this?
Well, he denied that he'd ever done anything familiar. He adopted a high moral tone, which I must admit I found rather funny.
Thank you, Mr. Blanford.
Mr. Blanford, do you love your wife?
Yes, of course.
But in spite of this, you both agreed to have extramarital affairs.
Yes.
Now, these affairs seem to have an almost geometrical neatness. Wife, husband, husband, wife, if you see what I mean. Now, did these affairs happen spontaneously at the same time?
Yes.
You changed partners, in other words?
Yes.
Now, how did that come about exactly? I mean, did you all sit around and discuss it, or did it happen by chance? Or did you both leap into the arms of Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson at the first meeting?
Mrs. Sanderson and I were attracted to each other. And later on, Mr. Sanderson and Christine decided to, make a go of it as well.
By make a go of it as well, do you mean they decided to commit adultery?
If you like, yes.
I don't like it at all, Mr. Blanford. It would be true then to say that you and Mrs. Sanderson were very strongly attracted to each other.
Yes.
And then a short time afterwards, your wife and Mr. Sanderson decided to make a go of it as well.
Yes.
You make that sound rather lukewarm.
Not at all. It's a natural development.
Its naturalness is a matter of opinion, Mr. Blanford. Now, wasn't Mr. Sanderson very assiduous in his attentions to your wife?
He seemed to be.
But he cooled off when he became attracted to Margaret Lawler.
I don't know. He didn't confide in me.
But it is true to say, isn't it, that he was less keen on your wife than she was on him?
We don't believe in measuring our feelings.
Now, you and Mrs. Sanderson are still very much attracted to each other, aren't you?
Yes.
Well, your wife must have been jealous of this attachment if it was so much stronger than her own, must she not?
Not at all.
Mr. Blanford, your wife has felt that her marriage has failed, hasn't she?
No. I've told you we have a successful marriage.
Are you really asking the court to believe that a marriage is deemed successful only when both partners find satisfaction outside of it?
That's not what I said. Obviously, you need a firm base, you need a strong feeling for your wife or husband, but that doesn't mean that you are tethered to them for the rest of your life.
Have you ever thought of divorcing your wife?
Oh, you're looking for business.
Mr. Blanford, if that sort of behaviour occurs again, I shall hold you to be in contempt of court.
I'm sorry, but I found that question offensive.
You will nevertheless answer in a proper manner. Will you please continue, Mr. Lloyd?
Yes, thank you, my lord. Mr. Blanford, have you ever thought of divorcing your wife?
Never.
You think perhaps that a husband has a duty to stick by his wife in times of trouble?
Yes.
And that loyalty would extend to covering up for her and telling lies?
If necessary, yes, but in this case it hasn't.
Hasn't it? Well, now, you told my learned friend that you had occasion to speak to Mr. Curtis, your neighbour, about an alleged improper suggestion that he made to your wife.
Yes.
Well, when did this conversation take place?
I don't remember, some time ago.
A long time ago or recently?
It was just after we went to live at the Close.
Yet you invited this man, a man who you claim made an improper suggestion to your wife, to your barbecue party.
Yes. Christine is very forgiving. Besides, we both liked Mrs. Curtis.
Oh, come on now, Mr. Blanford. Isn't this story of an improper suggestion merely a fabrication which you've devised simply to cast doubt on Mr. Curtis's impartiality?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Blanford. No further questions.
I call Trevor Sanderson, my
Well,
lord.
you may stand down.
Trevor Sanderson, please. Come and say so.
What is your religion?
I don't have one.
You wish to affirm?
Yes.
Please read out loud the words on that card.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Are you Trevor Graham Sanderson?
I am.
And you live at 19 Winchester Close, Fulchester?
No.
What is your address?
I now live at the Melvois Hotel, Fulchester.
The court should have been notified of this change of address.
Well, I'm sorry, my lord, but I only moved 2 or 3 days ago.
Are you the husband of Anita Fleur Sanderson and formerly of 19 Winchester Close?
Yes.
Why have you changed your address?
I no longer wish to live with my wife.
Why is that?
There have been differences between us for a long time, and this trial has made up my mind for me.
Would you kindly explain what you mean?
I consider that my wife's judgment has been clouded by her infatuation with Mr. Blandford, and this may have coloured her evidence against Mrs. Blandford.
Are you saying that your wife may have perjured herself?
No, my lord, I said that I thought her judgment was clouded. That doesn't mean to say I think she's been deliberately telling lies.
That is what you believe?
Yes.
Do you know of any reason why Mrs. Blandford should want to deliberately harm Margaret Lawler?
I can't think of any.
Well, were you having an affair with Margaret Lawler?
No.
Well, your wife says she saw you in bed together.
Ah, yes, well, that's a bit unfortunate, but it doesn't constitute an affair.
Mr. Sanderson, what does, to your mind, constitute an affair?
Well, I really don't know, my lord. It's a word I never use of in relation to myself or my friends. An affair is something rather furtive for people who aren't liberated. It smacks of hotel bedrooms rented by the hour.
Then how would you describe your extramarital experience with Margaret Lawler or Christine Blandford?
It's a relationship.
Semantics.
How did you regard Margaret Lawler, then?
She was and is a close friend.
Was the fact that you slept with Mrs. Lawler known to Mrs. Blandford?
No, I never had any occasion to mention it to her.
Do you recognize this letter, Exhibit 2, my lord?
Yes, it's a letter written by Margaret to me.
Now, it has been said that this letter came into Mrs. Blandford's possession. How could that have happened?
I don't know.
Could she have taken it out of your pocket on one of her visits to you?
Hardly. I'd have noticed if she'd been rummaging about in my pockets. Besides, I never keep letters in my pocket.
Where do you keep them?
They're usually in my bureau, in my rumpus room.
Does anyone else, apart from yourself, have access to that bureau?
No. Only Anita.
Did you, at any time, conduct a sexual liaison with Mrs. Blandford?
Yes, of course.
And has that now ceased?
Yes, we haven't slept with each other since Halloween.
Now, you're reported as having been seen in the Royal George Hotel in Preston on April the 18th of this year with Mrs. Blandford. Now, were you at that hotel on that date?
Yes, I was.
And did you sign in another woman as your wife?
Yes.
Was that woman Mrs. Blandford?
No.
Well, who was she?
I don't know. She told me her name was Melanie.
You don't know her name and address?
I'm afraid I don't. I did try to find her, but she was actually a common prostitute. I was told she was somewhere in Liverpool, but I don't know where.
Now, even when your relationship with Mrs. Blandford cooled, did you continue to see her?
Yes, of course.
And so, who ended the relationship then?
Relationships have a life of their own. And like all life, they come to an end.
You are not here to deliver bon mot. The question was perfectly clear. Did you spurn Christine Blandford, or did she spurn you?
Well, I'm sorry, my lord, but it really isn't a question of spurning. We continued to see each other. Christine told me that night that she wanted to discontinue the sexual part of our relationship.
So she spurned you sexually?
Not really. The sex had been a bit ropey for a long time. She was the one who took the initiative and said what we were both thinking.
Well, in the light of that, can you conceive that Mrs. Blandford could have been jealous of Mrs. Lawler?
No, there was nothing for her to be jealous about. Besides, Christine isn't a jealous person.
Now, Mr. Sanderson, did you see the incident with the kebab spit?
Yes, I did.
Will you describe what you saw?
Well, there was a bit of a stampede. Everybody had been drinking. They were pushing and shoving a bit to get first pick. Christine was doing all the work, dishing out the kebabs as best as she could in the circumstances. You know, being a bit high. Everybody was. She was very lively. She kept up a stream of chatter, trying to jolly everybody along. I said, "You look like one of the Three Musketeers waving those sticks about." She was holding out the kebab spits to people, and it did pass through my mind that it was dangerous. When she came to serve Margaret, she seemed to skid on the grass and she shouted.
Now, who was she shouting at?
She was shrieking to people to get out of the way.
Did you see the kebab spit strike Mrs. Lawler?
Yes, I was only standing a few feet away from her.
And was it a result of a blow deliberately aimed?
No, of course not. The spit just seemed to fly through the air as she lost her balance.
Now, was there any general accusation of assault at that time?
No, we were all too busy attending to Margaret. I wanted to take her to hospital in my Stag, but Anita already had her Avenger in the drive.
How would you describe Mrs. Lawler's state of mind immediately after the accident?
Well, she was suffering from shock. Sobbing and that, naturally, she was a bit hysterical.
But you say that she made no accusations immediately at that time?
None at all.
Now, when did you learn that she'd accused Mrs. Blandford of deliberately striking her?
Not that night. When we visited her the next day, we found that the police had been, at her request, to the bedside.
Your marriage has broken down, Mr. Sanderson. Why is that?
My wife seems to believe that her future lies with Mr. Blandford. They seem unusually attached to each other.
So your wife regards Mrs. Blandford as an obstacle to the future she sees for herself with Mr. Blandford?
It's possible.
Thank you, Mr. Sanderson.
Sanderson, by my reckoning, which may of course be deficient, as I was never very strong in arithmetic, you admit to having slept with 4 women in the past year. That's Anita Sanderson, Christine Blandford, Margaret Lawler, and a common prostitute. Is that correct?
No, I never admitted to having slept with my wife. In fact, I haven't.
Mr. Sanderson, do you have any sense of honour towards women?
I don't understand what you mean by honour.
Well, these women that you take up and discard so lightly, do you have any feelings of loyalty towards them afterwards?
Yes, of course.
And isn't that why you're protecting Christine Blandford, your former mistress?
I'm not protecting her. I've no need to.
Aren't you? You say that Mrs. Blandford didn't know that you were sleeping or had slept with Margaret Lawler. Yet a letter comes into Mrs. Blandford's possession, a letter couched in the most affectionate terms written by Mrs. Lawler. And you still say that Christine Blandford had no knowledge of your sleeping with Mrs. Lawler.
It wasn't conclusive.
But it surely must have aroused her suspicion.
Possibly, but as she was the one who had requested that we discontinue our sexual relations, there would have been no reason for her to be jealous. Christine wasn't jealous.
Ah, yes, I forgot. According to you, she had discontinued the relationship. Well, perhaps it was because of that you were at the Royal George Hotel in Preston on April the 18th with a common prostitute.
Perhaps.
A woman who has apparently disappeared off the face of the earth.
Even prostitutes are mortal.
But it's most convenient, though.
No, I did try to contact her, but nobody seems to know of her existence.
If indeed she existed at all. Mr. Curtis doesn't seem to think she did. Did you see Mr. Curtis in the hotel on that evening?
Yes, I did.
Did you speak to him?
I said good evening.
Did your friend say good evening?
Well, that wasn't quite her style. I did say she was a tart.
Answer the question, Mr. Sanderson, and do not indulge in flippant remarks.
Well, I'm sorry, my lord, but Mr. Curtis neglected to say that where he saw us was the Regency Grill, and the lighting is entirely in muted flambeau with little red lamps at each table. It really is very dim in there.
But despite this dimness, Mr. Curtis didn't mistake you. But he did mistake a common prostitute for Christine Blandford, his next-door neighbour. Is that what you're saying?
Actually, she wasn't all that common. She'd been convent-educated.
Mr. Sanderson, if there are any more remarks of that nature, I shall hold you to be in contempt of court.
Well, I'm sorry, my lord, but I was only reporting the whole truth. She did, in fact, tell me that she'd been brought up at a convent in Lytham St. Anne's, and she was very well spoken. I was only trying to indicate that it might be possible to confuse her with a woman like Mrs. Blandford.
Nevertheless, I find your manner offensive. Please conduct yourself with more propriety.
Thank you, my lord. Now, you say that your wife imagines her future to lie with Mr. Blandford.
Yes.
Well, with whom does your future lie, Mr. Sanderson? With Mrs. Blandford, if she's acquitted?
No.
With whom, then?
I really don't know.
With Margaret Lawler, perhaps?
No.
But it would have been reasonable of Mrs. Blandford to assume that that was precisely what you'd planned at the time of the party, would it not? You did escort Mrs. Lawler to the barbecue. You admit to having slept with her. And Mrs. Blandford was in the possession of a letter written by Mrs. Lawler to you. Is that not so?
But Mrs. Blandford and I were no longer lovers.
That's what you keep telling me, Mr. Sanderson. But for a woman who has renounced her lover to continue to see him alone on Mondays and Thursdays, isn't that a little bizarre?
We were friends. It isn't bizarre for friends to see each other regularly.
Now, Mr. Sanderson, you say that your wife's judgment is clouded. But is it not more true to say that it is your own judgment that is suspect, and that everything you've told us, and the manner in which you've told it, indicate an attempt to discredit both your wife, whom you've now decided to leave, and Mrs. Lawler, of whom you have also tired, apparently because of your insatiable appetite for women?
That's quite untrue. It's because of the kind of life we lead that our marriages are under such pressure. We move around so often. There's nobody on the estate likely to stay for more than 3 years at the most. Our work moves us on from town to town. You make instant friendships and drop them when you move and take up with another lot. You've no family background. You've nothing in common, except that you're climbing the professional ladder and shifting about from place to place.
Yes. So that's fascinating, Mr. Sanderson. But to get back to the case, was it not as a result of one of your many entanglements, namely with the accused, that she, imagining Margaret Lawler to be her successor, as indeed she was, on meeting her became jealous, argumentative, high on drink, and then deliberately and maliciously attacked Mrs. Lawler?
Not in the least. It was an accident.
Thank you, Mr. Sanderson.
That is the case for the defence, my lord.
Now, members of the jury, you may well feel that none of the individuals concerned in this confusing tangle of relationships, licit and illicit, emerges with any great credit from the events that you've heard described in this court today. you may well be amazed, as I am, to find some bizarre new modes of conduct arising round that institution which most of us believe to be the fundamental cornerstone of our civilization. I am referring, of course, to the institution of marriage. You may also be disturbed to find that these new modes of conduct are prevalent not among the poor and the outcast, but among those sections of our community who, by their privileged position, should embody those principles that we consider to be right and true. However that may be, you are required here to seek what is true, a task rendered doubly difficult by the evidence that you have heard in this court and the manner in which it has been presented. You are required to decide one fundamental issue: whether the action of Christine Blandford was a simple accident or whether it was a deliberate attempt to wound Margaret Lawler. Now, you've heard varying accounts of this incident, all of them mostly unreliable, considering most of the witnesses had been drinking. Now, we know that Mrs. Blandford proffered a kebab spit to Mrs. Lawler, that she took a fresh kebab from the fire. We know that the grass was wet, that the barbecue was unstable, and that Mrs. Blandford was wearing unsuitably fashionable shoes. Now, it's clear that some disagreements had arisen between these two women during the course of the evening. Now, was it a bitter personal dispute, as Mrs. Sanderson insists, or was it a heated difference of opinion? Well, that is for you to decide. At the time of the incident, it was agreed by all concerned that Mrs. Blandford did cry out. Now, was that an incoherent cry? Was it abuse at Mrs. Lawler, or was it a warning shout? You must remember that Mrs. Lawler made no accusation against Mrs. Blandford immediately after the incident. Now, was that because she was too preoccupied with her own pain, or was it because the idea had not at that point occurred to her? These are just some of the questions you may well be asking yourself. Now, the questions of fact are for you alone to decide, and the prosecution must prove them beyond reasonable doubt. The elements of the offence are, first, that the defendant inflicted a wound on Mrs. Lawler, and it is clear on her own admission that it was the skewer in her hand which caused the wound. The second element which the prosecution have to establish is that this wound was caused intentionally. The prosecution have suggested a motive which is, in short, that Mrs. Blandford was jealous of Mrs. Lawler. Now, it's a question for you whether the prosecution have made out their case for this. However, even if you accept that there might have been some motive or some animosity between these women, you must still be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that on this occasion Mrs. Blandford intended to cause Mrs. Lawler serious bodily harm. If you are sure of this, it will be your duty to convict. If you have any reasonable doubt, then it will be your duty to return a verdict of not guilty. Now, members of the jury, will you kindly retire to consider your verdict?
All stand. Members of the jury, will your foreman please rise? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the accused Christine Blandford guilty or not guilty of malicious wounding?
Not guilty.
Mrs. Blandford, you are free to go.
Court will rise.
Join us again when our cameras return to watch a leading case in the Crown Court.